everybody, it's Chris Bezanoy or Chris B with CSB Security Inc. with yet another informational video. Today we're going to talk about the protection for the perimeter of an ACMPR or Cannabis Act site. Before we go any further, a disclaimer, this is based on my opinion, it's based on my experience in the industry over the past 5 years, based on over 300 applications, over 50 attestations to Health Canada, a lot of dealings with Health Canada, a lot of information from other consultants, and of course discussions in the industry. However, this is simply my opinion, and opinions may vary. So, let's dive right into it. As we know, under the ACMPR, you need to protect the perimeter of your site. Some people choose to use a fence line. Some people think that we don't need a fence line, we'll use the facility walls as the perimeter. Either way you look at it, the perimeter of your site, whether it be a phased approach or a full build out, has to be protected. There are challenges with doing so because of the wording in the ACMPR, which has now changed a little bit in the Cannabis Act. But the wording in the ACMPR right now simply states you must get actual or attempted intrusions onto the site, movement through the site, and tampering with the system. That, and I speak to this in another video, is a juggernaut of a gray area statement. What I mean by that is, Health Canada didn't mean any ill will. They weren't, obviously just going off half-cocked and saying, well, let's just come up with some statement and hope that it sticks. No, there was some thought to this. So they're not the ones to blame. As much as we like to blame them for everything, they are certainly not always to blame. But that juggernaut of a gray statement caused havoc across the industry. And I'll tell you why. The first one is, you get actual or attempted intrusions onto the site. So, I talk about actual, I talk about intrusions, I talked about attempted in another video, but the point being, how do you get actual? How do you get attempted? What is actual? What is attempted? We all know what intrusion is. What's movement through the site? We all know what tampering with the system is. So if you dissected each and every word in that one statement, you found that across the nation, everybody's opinion changed, especially some of the reviewers, with how you're going to be compliant with that one juggernaut of a statement. Here are some of the pitfalls. The first one being, say you decide to use a fence. Okay, Health Canada, we're going to be compliant with that statement by putting up a fence. We're going to use a fence disturbance system, and we're going to use the cameras on the facility walls, and we're going to task those guys with detecting motion and setting off an alarm after hours. Well, that sounds all fine and dandy, except for the fact anybody that's used a fence disturbance system will tell you they're the most finicky things out there. Yes, some fence disturbance systems have what they call weather stations, so they can kind of predict what's going to happen with the weather. Some have sensitivity, where you can either dumb it down or dial it up. So in other words, if there's wind and you're in a high wind situation, that fence will move back and forth. That will set off the intrusion detection cable along the fence line. We call them fence disturbance systems. There are challenges with those, but that, so far, is the easiest and best way to protect a perimeter. That gets actual, and it also gets attempted. Meaning, if somebody were to actually bust through the fence, well, it would set off an alarm. If somebody would actually try to climb over the fence, well, it would set off an alarm. If somebody tries to cut the fence, it'll set off an alarm. So it's actually getting, in essence, actual or attempted intrusions onto the site. The one challenging thing was it doesn't get movement through the site. And one would think, well, okay, movement is motion detection. So we want to know if somebody's gone through a fence line. We also want to know if they've moved through the site. Becomes a really unique challenge. Aside from the fence line being a little finicky with the fence disturbance system, we now have a situation where we're detecting motion, potentially, within the perimeter of the site, from the perimeter walls of the facility to the fence line. Sometimes that could be 150 feet. Sometimes that could only be 10 feet. And so what some of our clients did is said, okay, you know what? The integrator that we've hired said we're going to detect motion in the cameras, and that motion will be set off an alarm. And you sit there and go, okay, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, except for the fact, how do you decipher between what's a real alarm and what's not? What happens if a courier comes on site and they happen to go to the back of your facility and that travel path for that courier is covered by 16 cameras? Are we saying that your ULC listed monitoring center is now getting 16 alarms saying, uh-oh, camera 1 has motion, camera 2 has motion, camera 15 has motion, set off alarms and you have to investigate? Well, that would play havoc with your system, and of course, that would damper operations during the day. After hours, not such a big thing. Your facility's shut down, it's fully armed. But during hours, how do you tell the camera, by the way, this truck it's okay to be there, but this person walking near the fence, that's not okay? You can configure some analytics in the cameras to detect when it's a person walking the wrong way, when maybe it's a vehicle going by, but you'll find when you use those analytics, you're actually not really detecting motion from the fence line to the walls because you're masking everything. Everything is saying to the camera, hey, this green box, yeah, don't worry about it. We're allowing people to walk through this green box. But in essence, by that green box, you're actually telling the system we're not detecting movement through the site. Some people say, well, let's use motion detectors, these big optics units, which are mounted on the wall. And they sort of have a laser system that can detect when somebody walks through the beam. And you're like, okay, great. But again, during the day, how do you tell that beam, okay, this is a legitimate enter and this is a legitimate alarm? Some integrators have said, okay, well, what we'll do is when the motorized gate is pulsed open and that motorized gate opens, it shunts all the alarms all the way to the back of the facility where a vehicle can park. Okay, that's legitimate, but for how long does it shunt? Does it rearm itself after 30 seconds? Does an RPIC have to actually physically rearm those motions after a vehicle has left? What if the RPIC forgets? Did you just disarm the system entirely until the next day when you come in or when you realize it's unarmed? The ACMPR states must be armed at all times. So there's some unique challenges with your perimeter. Some clients have opted to say, you know what, we're not going to do a fence. Yeah, we'll put cameras on the outside of our facility, but our facility walls are now going to be the perimeter. It's not a bad way of going. You can put motion detectors along the outside of your walls. You can put motion detector inside your walls. You can have them in rooms, in cameras, in rooms, and all that kind of stuff. But keep in mind, you're telling Health Canada that the perimeter walls of your facility is now the perimeter of your site. Therefore, you must detect actual or attempted intrusions onto the site, movement through the site, and of course, tampering with the system. So what did that mean for motion detection on the outside of those walls? Well, that's great. It's okay for a solid wall, maybe on the north side of your facility where there's nobody that's going to walk by. But what about your main entrance? So are we saying the office areas now are protected by laser motion where if a visitor comes up, they may potentially set off an alarm? Do you have to disarm just that one section of the building every time a courier wants to go through it? Maybe there is a visitor that wants to come in. Maybe staff come in the morning and they have to quickly run to the intrusion detection keypad to disarm that laser. Does it rearm? What about for maintenance? What about if somebody wants to go outside for lunch? What if somebody happens to smoke and they want to go outside for a smoke? Are we saying we're arming and disarming these laser protection units on the outside of the facility on and off all day long? Because keep in mind, Health Canada says armed at all times. It's an interesting concept because sometimes Health Canada will say, that's okay, we don't mind those laser detectors, that's fine, we understand, it's armed most of the time, it'll set off an alarm. Sometimes Health Canada will say, I don't believe that. I'm not quite sure that's going to happen. When you get a courier, I know you're going to disarm those laser motions, so you're disarmed potentially for 20 minutes while you're doing cannabis transactions. Sometimes a reviewer will just not care what happens to the facility in the way of operations. They'll say, yeah, great, if you want to deal with 50 alarms, and that's how you're going to be compliant, fill your boots. You're still protecting the perimeter. If you want to spend most of your time answering emails or answering calls from your ULC listed monitoring center for all those alarms, that is up to you. You won't like it. It'll really hinder your production, but you can absolutely do so. You can hire a security guard that does nothing but look at a screen and look at all the alarms that goes by and figures out which one is real and which one's not. Sometimes you can use a fence disturbance system. You can task the cameras with sending emails to an RPIC after hours, and the RPIC can then remote into the system, review the cameras to make sure it's either a real alarm or a nuisance alarm. Sometimes a ULC listed monitoring center will be tasked with remoting in to the camera system whenever there's alarm. The point being is under the ACMPR, the protection for perimeters has been a hot topic. A lot of people have different opinions. All have been licensed. But some LPs have then decided to rip down a fence disturbance system. Maybe get rid of those laser motion detectors around the facility. Maybe figure out, well, it's not really a good idea to have motion detection inside your grow rooms, even though the 56 exemption says you don't need them. But because one of our walls in our grow room is actually a perimeter wall, we now need motion detectors inside a room with heavy motion. It is a real challenge. Now, under the Cannabis Act, it's still there. Must detect actual or attempted intrusions onto the site. What's gone now is movement through the site. You no longer need to detect movement through the site. Well, that's great. It still doesn't change the fact that the perimeter protection for a site is still really difficult to achieve. It's because of that one juggernaut of a statement, actual or attempted intrusions onto the site. Under the ACMPR, it's movement through the site, of course, is an addition, but under the Cannabis Act, there's no mention of movement through the site. One other thing I know that Health Canada likes to bring up all the time, and they say, well, great, you've got a fence disturbance system, your cameras are not tasked with motion detection, you're not using motion detectors on the outside of your facility. What if somebody pulls up a truck or a ladder or whatever the case may be, puts it beside the fence, hops over? How are you detecting then? How are you detecting an intrusion onto a site when there is no intrusion detection on the site because they circumvented the fence? There are some gray areas in that situation. Health Canada has licensed people that by saying, okay, your cameras are tasked with motion, they send off an alarm, that's great. You got a fence disturbance system, that's fantastic. You've got motion detectors around your walls, that's great. You got motion detectors inside your rooms, that's fantastic. I can tell you right now, once you get your license, I'm pretty sure most LPs are starting to review the perimeter protection and going, I'm not sure about this. It doesn't really work in our favor. You can't blame the manufacturers. To be honest with you, you can't blame the manufacturers for this kind of stuff happening inside the ACMPR and Cannabis Act industry because it is very unique. It's one of the only industries I've ever heard of that needs to retain images for 2 years, now down to 1 year under the Cannabis Act. It needs to get actual or attempted intrusions onto the site and motion through the site. I've never heard that statement before in my life, to be honest with you. But yet we're tasking these video surveillance systems that were never really meant and built to handle all that kind of motion. They may never have been built to know exactly what's a real alarm and what's not a real alarm. Defense disturbance systems, yeah, okay, it's better to expect them to know exactly what the weather conditions are like maybe, and to have that sensitivity for high wind situation, but it really is based on where your facility is. I know I've worked on a few facilities where we couldn't do a fence disturbance system because the winds were so high that fence disturbance system would go off at all times. I know that I've worked on facilities that are shared use where we couldn't use vibration detectors for the walls. Why? Because the facility was right beside a train yard. Well, those trains are going to set off that vibration alarm all the time, or those vibration alarms all the time. I know there's roof protection that you can use, cameras, lasers, that sort of thing. The point being is perimeter protection under the ACMPR and Cannabis Act is a really finicky thing. It's difficult to achieve ideally. You can get it done so you get a license, but it's going to be a pain in your butt. And that's unfortunately the reality of how this ACMPR industry has gone and now the new Cannabis Act. Now forget about even talking how you protect an outdoor grow. What about a micro grow? There's a lot of things to consider. Just know that under the Cannabis Act, that whole detection of actual and attempted intrusions onto the site and tampering with the system remains. The only thing that changes is the motion through the site. A little bit easier to swallow, still a pain in your butt. Either way, remember to follow us. We do a lot of videos. If you have any questions about the protection of the perimeter, like I said, I've done over 310 applications. There are easier ways to solve it. There are better ways of solving it. Unfortunately, some are going to be less cumbersome, some are more expensive, some are less ideal, all of which will eventually get you a license. Some will get you a license quicker than others. Either way, reach out to us. We can certainly help you in that regard. Thanks for watching, and we'll look for you at the next video.